I'd like to now invite our lunchtime keynote speaker to the podium. Laura Berry is Executive Director of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. This is an organization that emphasizes community, social justice, and responsible investing. Once again, like so many of us here, Laura has one of those very interesting careers. She worked for 17 years as a large cap value portfolio manager on Wall Street. She also worked for 5 years as a chemical engineer. True. I was pausing to see if anyone would guess that one. Bruce, I think you have a rival here in terms of... and she decided to move into the domain of socially responsible investing. So again, one of the things I love about this group, and I think is a bit unusual for this kind of forum, is that it's here in a business school. And so we really want to speak with and engage with practitioners and investors along with experts on religion. So, Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, David. So my plan is to speak for about 30 minutes or so. To give you a little bit of a sense of one place where business and religion, I would argue, have come together in a really interesting and, frankly, from a practitioner point of view, successful way for about 4 decades. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where we sit, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, in the broader world of business and religion. Talk a little bit about what we've done and how we've changed over the last 4 decades. And then finally, because I'm among scholars, I'm going to borrow from the playbook of some wonderful European scholars who've done some ethnographic and behavioral economics studies of ICCR and how and why it is that we might be developing a new model for business and religion to work together, and why they think it works. So I'm going to try and do all of that in about 30 minutes. I'm going to try and do it before my voice actually disappears. Allison Lander from our organization can attest that I don't normally sound like this. So let me start with my prepared remarks actually, by saying, first of all, it's a tremendous pleasure to be with you today, and I'm really, really grateful to the Center for Financial Policy for the invitation. It's a particular honor to be invited to address the inaugural, note I said inaugural, assuming there will be others, the inaugural Henry Kaufman Forum on Religious Traditions and Business Behavior. Ever since reading On Money and Markets, and I am bringing a copy of the book in case you don't know about it, shortly after leaving Wall Street in 2001, I've been a big fan of Dr. Kaufman's. I actually brought the book along today hoping for an autograph. So I hope he likes what I say, because otherwise he might write something mean in the book. But I do have to say, I was really struck by how eerily prescient many of his cautions were. And if you will indulge me, I just want to read one little part, just chosen at random. When the proponents of the benign impact view miss, what the proponents of the benign impact view miss is the potential for derivatives, we all know about them, to amplify the business cycle by introducing more leverage into the system and thus expand credit availability, especially for margin borrowers. During an upswing in the business cycle, this additional borrowing capacity allows the private sector to withstand monetary restraint for a longer time. But in a down cycle, the amplification can create what we've all lived through in 2008. And so being reminded of Dr. Kaufman's book was a real treat for me. Because I've paid attention to his thoughtful, straight-up commentary for decades, I really thought that I had enough material to set in a few pithy Dr. Doom jokes as we all settled in, and my hope was that we wouldn't turn lunchtime into nap time. But after poking around on the internet, I discovered that Dr. Kaufman and I actually share a very special link. As I was trying to find a connection that would link my personal history and workaday Wall Street career with his considerably more stellar endeavors, admittedly no small task, I discovered that we celebrate a shared history with an anniversary every spring. You see, Henry Kaufman and Company was born in the spring of 1988, launching Dr. Kaufman's adventure as a first-time business owner, the same year that I launched my own adventure as a first-time parent. And after 26 years, it's safe to say that both leaps of faith have turned out pretty well. If, by the way, you were hoping for Dr. Doom, and at the time I didn't know Dr. Gloom also was going to be here. If you were waiting for those jokes, please accept my apologies. I'd also like to thank Professors Cecilia and Dilker for setting up my remarks today so beautifully. I really appreciated the insights that you shared in your explorations of the intersection of business and religion. By asking us to consider whether business and religion are partners or adversaries, and by wrestling with the moral imperatives of capitalism, you have both described an interface that is becoming increasingly blurred. I'm not sure that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly the blurring is occurring. I don't know about all of you in this room, but, and as scholars, I'm going to make an assumption. I find that some of life's most interesting questions actually take place where the boundaries are kind of fuzzy. And although I doubt that my remarks will completely bridge whatever boundary exists between morality and markets, I do hope that some of what I say today will deepen the exploration the professors began and set the stage for the rest of the forum. As David noted, in college I studied science, and I began my career in the 70s as an engineer. I was specializing in beer cans, by the way, in case you were curious. I can tell you way too much about how beer cans are made. But I spent most of the 80s and the 90s working on Wall Street, and from the vantage point of a young woman in a number of decidedly manly professions, I learned a thing or two about boundaries. The first was that boundaries create tension, and I found it very interesting that tension was a theme throughout our morning. The second was that tension actually creates energy. Whether we are studying the leading edge of a weather front, a cellular membrane, or even the event horizon at the edge of a black hole, interesting natural phenomena occur at the interface of an active system. Nearly all creation stories begin with the creator imposing a boundary, oftentimes bringing light from darkness. I don't think it's a coincidence that intriguing things happen at the intersection of man-made systems like business and religion. For institutional investors who have straddled the disciplines of business and religion, one can point to a long history of demonstrated investment success. Religious investors who are inspired by faith and committed to action have developed a system that over the years has challenged companies to shift from the adversarial position 40 years ago to one of truly engaged partnership. In today's remarks, I'd like us to take a quick look at how faith-based investors have developed these ideas over time. And I'd also like us to think about why some scholars believe that we've in fact created a very powerful new model for effective activism. Much of what I share is drawn from the 43-year history of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which is an organization whose experience and practices are representative of the broader stakeholder group of faith-based investors. ICCR's membership is comprised of about 300 institutional investors, representing over $100 billion in assets. representing faith-based communities with congregations all over the world, asset management companies, labor unions, foundations, public and private pension funds, colleges and university endowments, although very few, I might add, college and university endowments, which I find rather curious, and a global network of allies. ICCR members are not only shareholders, but over the years, they've become trusted partners as investors who build value while promoting a more just and sustainable world. Our 43-year history in the morality and markets business is a good run. However, in the 400 years or so since the creation of the corporate entity, people of faith have consistently spoken out about the social impact of capital. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders have long recognized practices to encourage ethical investments while identifying the investments to avoid. During colonial times in North America, both Quakers and Methodists explicitly avoided investments that supported the slave trade. Muslims have strict prohibitions against interest-bearing investments. Likewise, both Jewish and Catholic social justice teachings are very clear on the responsibilities that we have as people of God to attend to the needs of the poor. Religious investors have been shaping what some call responsible investment practices since long before that expression was coined. Indeed, the current field of responsible investment is in itself a legacy of faith-based efforts to link ethics and investment. This influence is particularly noteworthy in the early history of the United States and its Puritan founders. In fact, John Wesley often taught on money and materialism, developing his trilateral sermon in which he challenged Christians to, can anybody quote this?
Make more, save more, give more.
Absolutely. Gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. He preached from oft-quoted biblical texts like 1 Timothy, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains." Wesley also drew from the Sermon on the Mount. These verses from the Gospel of Moses, the Gospel of Moses, he wasn't doing Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, seem to set up the dichotomy that I think is one of this forum's themes. No one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. I fear religious investors might not be entirely in agreement with the writer of Matthew's Gospel. Although most religious investors continue to avoid investing in activities contrary to the tenets of their faith, the sin stocks, for example, that have traditionally included alcohol and other intoxicants like sweetened tea south of the Mason-Dixon line. That stuff is incredible. Tobacco, weapons manufacturers, and gambling. The level of sophistication demonstrated by religious investors and their allies has grown far beyond avoidance. The story behind the growing sophistication in approach and influence is one example of a place where morality and markets are bridged. In particular, we'll look at the field of shareholder advocacy and how the faith-based investment community has participated in shaping this practice. For over 40 years from ICCR's founding, shareholders around the world are using engagement practices refined by practitioners over many years of faithful, persistent action. So when Dr. Kaufman asked us earlier, so when all this bad stuff was happening, where were religions? I would offer to say in a sweet small voice from outside the cave, we were doing this. There just aren't enough people who know about it, so I appreciate the time to talk about it. Faith-based investment activity is closely linked to the rise of corporate power in the second half of the 20th century. So much so that last year Time magazine posed the question, are companies more powerful than countries? So when did religious investors start to move beyond this concept of avoiding the bad sin stocks? ICCR was founded to coordinate religious investor action in response to the emergence of a galvanizing issue, South African apartheid. In the early 70s, the abhorrent process of apartheid, the legislated segregation of races in South Africa, became a rallying point for faith communities and their investment activity. How many of us were in college at that time, were part of the big South African anti-apartheid movement? That was my first taste of this work. In 1971, the Episcopal Church in the USA filed the first ever religious-sponsored shareholder resolution with General Motors, requesting that the company withdrew its operations until apartheid was abolished. Other faith organizations soon joined the campaign and organized themselves as the ad hoc Interfaith Committee on Social Responsibility in Investment, which later became ICCR. Now think about the brilliance of this tactical approach. Here was General Motors, which was the largest market cap company at that time. Also, General Motors had just done something really interesting, had just invited Bishop Sullivan to join their board, an African-American preacher from Philadelphia, one of the first African-Americans to sit on a major corporate board. And here we are talking about apartheid. Talk about setting up a moral dynamic that could create a movement. I think, again, faith investors looking through the lens of faith really got it right in the anti-apartheid movement. Shareholder activism from faith-based communities led to a new adversarial dynamic between large corporations and their investors. Accustomed to more compliant investors, corporations bristled at this check on their power and pushed back by tightening the rules around the filing of resolutions. Those that were targets of activity took to waiting until the last minute to disclose the dates of their annual general meetings and began holding them in out-of-the-way locations to limit shareholder participation. One beleaguered, please groan in sympathy, one beleaguered corporate secretary addressed the audience gathered at the 1971 annual meeting of Gulf Oil, summing up the feelings of many in saying, "Before now, our shareholders have always been loyal." So, religious investors causing trouble, as people of faith should do more often. Religious investors quickly added to the list of issues they took on via shareholder advocacy. Growing from the anti-apartheid efforts, religious investors reported 478 individual actions involving over 200 companies in the year 2013. Many of the issues ICCR members began addressing during the 70s foretold, and again, this notion of when you look at any field through the lens of faith, there is a possibility of prophecy. So, they foretold in the 70s many of the cultural shifts that would actually impact business performance many years later. Things like equal employment opportunity and corporate diversity initiatives, concerns over military profiteering, excessive drug pricing, access to adequate nutrition and infant formula marketing practices, political contributions and lobbying by corporations, equal access to capital, and the environmental impact of extractive and other industrial activity. Brief side note on the political lobbying rules. There's a couple of interesting rules making their way through the SEC and through Congress right now. And if you want to see how ICCR is viewed by the libertarian community, check on our Senate briefing yesterday when the Acton Institute started to talk about Laura Berry's murder, which I guess means group as well, murder of activists. It's pretty. I was kind of flattered that I sounded so mean, just picking on the SEC. I feel very badly. As ICCR members expanded their activism, corporate secretaries' frustrations grew. In 1983, A. Joseph Dowd, the corporate secretary for American Electric Power, complained, "For the past few years, we have watched helplessly as well-intentioned shareholders have bombarded and overloaded proxy statements of issuers with proposals that are at best occasionally constructive and at worst absurd and oftentimes more appropriate for the platform of a politician. God forbid that business and politics should be linked." In the same year, however, SEC Commissioner Longworth spoke more admiringly of the active religious investors, saying, "The magic," interesting choice of words, "the magic of this process is that the proxy lands on the desk of every important institutional investor. It can't be thrown in a wastebasket without being opened. The trustees actually have to look at it." The 1980s saw religious investors develop an interest in improving equitable access to capital, which would lead religious investors to be among the first voices raising public concerns about underwriting practices in the later decades. Due to their traditional roles in schools, hospitals, and social service agencies in vulnerable communities, women religious, also known as nuns, were well positioned to observe and respond to the needs of the poor. This unique perspective led to over 400 investor actions in the mid-1990s, these are all public, and beyond, expressing concerns about financial innovations related to subprime debt, collateral, and risk assessment. These early warnings were later well documented in the media. An article published in the Christian Science Monitor described ICCR members as an early warning system for mainstream investors and policymakers. The global economic crisis that was gaining momentum in the fall of 2008 was in part the result of catastrophic defaults and over-leveraging that began in part in the very neighborhoods where ICCR members began their access efforts in the 1980s. By observing the impact on consumers through a community lens, the religious investors had access to a different sort of insight, creating opportunities with a sort of justice arbitrage that might have guided policy and investor action. If you leave this talk with anything other than an appreciation for sweetened iced tea, I would really like you to leave with this, the idea of arbitraging faith. Because the reality is, as religious investors, as moral investors, we look through a different lens. It doesn't mean we don't need to grow pension funds so that we can honor commitments to beneficiaries. It doesn't mean we don't need to grow university endowments so we can build more nice buildings. But what it does mean is that if you're looking, arbitrage is nothing more than an information differential. Well, I would contend that people of faith have an information differential because they look at and make judgments based on, in addition to science and math and quant analysis and all those other really, really important things that, smart people like to do. But you also, when you're looking through the lens of faith, you see things differently and you see things early. That's why prophecy and faith are so connected in the canon. The 1990s led religious investors to focus significantly more attention on the environment. The attention of shareholders to environmental issues was driven in part by highly publicized events that were happening, including the particular health disaster of the Love Canal, the environmental disasters surrounding the Exxon Valdez and the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster. It was also closely linked to implications for corporate performance represented by a changing regulatory environment, such as the Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund Act, bless you, of 1980. Religious investors appreciated the hand-in-glove relationship as regulatory reform allowed them to move away a little bit from adversarial approaches, making the business case for companies to adopt voluntary initiatives for waste reduction, energy conservation, and a more rigorous commitment to public safety. The conversation between religious investors and companies had begun to focus on risk management more explicitly. Religious investors broadened their efforts after the turn of the millennium to take shareholder advocacy and link it more directly to financial consequences of corporate and social environmental policy. Today, efforts cover a really wide range of issues, everything from modern-day slavery, which is politely referred to as human trafficking, to issues of financial reform, to issues of environmental justice, all of which I think relate ultimately to a company's risk management portfolio. But you know what? Even if something is legal, even if something is ethical, what faith-based investors bring is the idea that legal and ethical is a good start, but moral and just is even better. And the world works better when we pay attention to these things. Typical of the growing support for the corporate social responsibility initiatives, in honor of ICCR's 40th anniversary, which we celebrated in 2011, a number of representatives from leading corporations weighed in on the influence of religious stakeholders over the years. Mark Preisinger, who was Coca-Cola's Director of Corporate Governance, said, "Over the years, the Coca-Cola Company built a relationship of trust and respect with ICCR as we worked together to address many challenges facing our company. This collaboration on a range of issues from workplace rights to water stewardship has truly led to an improvement of our policies and practices." Similarly, William Clay Ford, Ford Motor Company's executive chairman, and oh, by the way, Ford is one of the formerly known as the Big Three companies that ICCR has publicly celebrated because of some commitments to voluntary fleet emission standards reduction, blah, blah, blah. Does anybody remember which of the Big Three didn't need a bailout in 2008? Is responsible behavior a proxy for good management? I would contend that it is. So what William Clay Ford said was, when I began speaking out on environmental and social issues more than 30 years ago, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility was a welcome voice of encouragement among many who were doubtful. They cheered us on when we made progress and challenged us to move faster and do better when we didn't. Thanks in large part to the work done by ICCR, today the idea that business can do well by doing good is widely acknowledged. And finally, Mark Spears, who's the director of Disney's Consumer Products and Sustainable Business Practices, added, "Today's increasingly complex social and environmental issues require a broad stakeholder approach, which is collaborative, informative, and mutually supportive. ICCR has routinely provided experience, insight, and a results orientation to a relationship with the Walt Disney Company, one that began in the mid-1990s. If people and organizations are in fact known by the relationships they keep, we are truly honored to be considered a member of the ICCR community." These are the words of corporate bridge builders describing the evolution of religious investors from adversaries to partners. The field of shareholder advocacy is now an established practice in the U.S. and internationally. But how has it come to scale? Longtime ICCR member representative and University of New Mexico business professor Harry Van Buren noted in a 2007 study that resolutions are not generally ends in themselves, but a means to the end. Shareholder activists seek to use the access to other shareholders and to the management afforded by the shareholder resolution, or even the threat of one, to engage in a dialogue with corporate management and attempt to effect operational and social change. Van Buren's comments really anticipated the fundamental shift in religious investor practices. The 2011-2012 corporate proxy season was the first year where the number of corporate engagements, and when I say corporate engagements, I mean voluntary engagements where corporations asked us to come in as a stakeholder group, outstripped the number of shareholder proposals filed. With the 2012-13 season following that same pattern. As the history suggests, religious investors are increasingly serving consultative roles, moving companies and their operations through what we call a hierarchy of change. ICCR members regularly use this hierarchy in assessing where a company's transformation falls on a scale that begins with the companies acknowledging the importance of the issue and ends with a public acknowledgement of the company's progress, as in the adoption of fleet emissions reduction targets by Ford Motor Company in 2008. In the current state of play, resolutions are often seen as a last resort, with religious investors choosing to file when private negotiation fails. In addition, once filed, if continuing negotiations between investors and management lead to successful conclusions, resolutions can, of course, be withdrawn. One ICCR leader described the early years this way: "For the most part, we really filed the shareholder resolution and then had absolutely no contact with the company until we went to the stockholder meeting. And in many cases, it was just giving your speech and waiting for the results. The results the member awaited were to meet the SEC required thresholds of 3, 6, or 10%. Now that's 3, 6, or 10% of a vote. This would not win any election, but it's for raising attention. These results would ensure the issue could be raised again the following year if the company did not comply with the requested change. Today's activist investors actually expect double-digit votes and are not at all surprised by tallies in the 30, 40, or 50% range. By all measures, a significant change in expectations. There is considerable fascination with both the fact of the increasing efficacy of the religious shareholder and in developing the theory of how these activist shareholders wield their influence. Two adorable young men from Europe, Daniel Beunza and Fabrizio Ferraro with IESE and the London School of Economics, have recently conducted an ethnographic study of ICCR members and staff to study how activist shareholders voice their concerns to the companies they invest in, influencing them to act more responsibly. Existing analyses of how social movements try to change corporate behavior have focused usually on confrontational tactics such as protests and boycotts. They assume that change will only happen as a consequence of management caving in. This study explores a partnership approach because remember, as religious investors, we own a piece of these companies. We don't just buy shares so we can pick on them. We actually need these companies to do well. And so in some ways, an adversarial relationship is kind of against our own interests in the long run. So this study explores this partnership approach, known as shareholder engagement, in which the activists who own the shares in a corporation have dialogues with management requesting them to change corporate policies or practices. So first, they talk about 4 steps of this process. The first is called sensitizing. That what ICCR members do, and think back to some of the issues that William Clay Ford brought up in his quick quote. He said, when he started looking around and wondering about environmental issues, people from ICCR almost gave him permission as a senior leader. He couldn't actually go to his board of trustees and say, I think we ought to worry about the environment. I mean, he's a car company, for heaven's sakes. But when he said, these dark shareholders are driving me crazy and they're going to make us look bad, all of a sudden, not only was he sensitized to the issue, but somebody had his back. So sensitizing is described as engendering mutual respect between the activists and the executives. The evolution of the corporate dialogue is well documented in this study. But religious investors have also served another purpose, the reframing process, which also includes articulating the business case for desired change. This describes the more transformational cases of shareholder dialogue and can ultimately lead to change across an entire industry or industrial sector. Now, this is another interesting process because as you reframe, movement people generally are reluctant to reframe. There is a black and a white, there is you are doing this bad thing, cut it out. That's the approach. But in fact, once religious investors started to realize that it didn't matter why the company changed, if they changed because of the moral case or they changed because of the business case, but they stopped using slaves in their operations in a developing country. The outcome was in fact what really mattered, and being a little more pragmatic about developing the business case, reframing, in other words, might be important. In committing, which is the third step, Ferraro and Beunza characterize the length of the relationship matters. Now think about the unique market niche of the faith-based investor. Allison has heard this joke 1,000 times, but I'm going to say it again. Faith-based investors are perhaps the only institutional investors whose investment horizon is eternity. So we are the ultimate long-term investors. We are truly committed, and the companies know that. So the length of the relationship matters. The fact that religious investors are committed activists and represent serious long-term financial fiduciaries demonstrate commitment throughout decades, literally decades of dialogue. And finally, there is the breaching process, which requires participants to break through organizational inertia by defying the dominant interaction order in face-to-face meetings. An example of this very, very recently was with the scandal with our friends from Walmart in Mexico, when Walmart was discovered to be bribing officials to be able to build stores. The day that story broke in the New York Times, you just cannot imagine how much telecommunication was flying over the ICCR lines. And we said some things encouraging our friends at Walmart to be more transparent, to really tell us the truth. Let us know what happened, let us know why it happened, and let's move on. And we said live in the press that we were disappointed that Walmart senior management was circling the wagons and was not, in fact, being as transparent as we liked, but we hoped that they would. They were very mad at us and didn't talk to us for a whole year. We hurt their feelings, but they're back now. But that's an example of breaching, where you hold folks to account for what they do. Of course, there are challenges to this partnership with corporations approach. It can test the patience of more externally focused activism. We are often criticized by more activist, even faith-based activists, because we're selling out to corporations, we're kissing up to corporations, we're like, but I'm sorry, we're investors. We have pension plans. If you're not going to work with corporations, I don't know who you're going to work with. Can't just buy nothing but U.S. government bonds, which don't pay much anyway. Pardon the editorial comments. But anyway, so we get a lot of criticism for actually not being brave enough, not being strong enough, for being too cooperative and not adversarial enough. Some claim that religious investors are being used by the very corporations they are working to change, a sort of corporate co-option of the religious investor. But I would argue that perhaps this 40-year story of religious investors who have learned to move from investor adversaries to shareholder advocates actually demonstrates that bridging the boundary between morality and markets is possible. For nearly 5,000 years, the world's great faith traditions have had a lot to say about wealth and justice, and it's clear that they intend to use their collective voice as investors. So I hope this really quick overview of ICCR's work, our development, and how we have adopted our methodology has given you at least an insight that what you're trying to do in this room can work. It can work across disciplines. It can change people's minds. And I will also say that my colleague Allison Lander back there, if you want any of our materials, or if you're a college or university that happens to be embroiled in the fossil fuel divestment movement, one side note is that the young campus activists around the country have co-opted the South Africa story. What they are saying, well, you should divest from an entire sector of the global economy, what they are saying about that, and comparing it to the South Africa story, is factually and spiritually wrong. So we've done a great deal of scholarship and work and gotten some legal opinions. So if any of you represent universities that are concerned about that, just give Allison your card and we'll send you our stuff. But I thank you all for your very kind attention. Should I take questions or should I just sit down?
One or two, see if we have one or two questions.
Okay. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Laura, for that very thorough discussion about what IIRC does. Do you work with any other organizations like ICI?
We, you know, it's funny. We are working with more and more mainstream organizations. However, they tend to be industry groups like CII, the Council of Institutional Investors. They tend to be groups like that. And some of the mainstream investment field building groups like ICI have not really reached out because I still think that they see activist first. They don't see how seriously and frankly in what sophisticated ways we really approach our responsibilities as financial fiduciaries. So I'd love to work with more of the mainstream investment groups like ICI. For now, like I said, it's mostly the field building groups like CII and some of those guys. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you so much for your attention.